Good morning and welcome back. Day 4 of our plenary session. We have sirens, bells, whistles going off to celebrate Diane Larson's birthday. So this is birthday week. So at this board, yeah, I didn't say that. So today I think we have a lot to talk about this morning. Remember, we're going to 1 p.m. today, and then this afternoon there are a number of other meetings occurring. But today Lynn is going to take the lead, but she's going to be assisted by Sally Ann and Jesper. So we look forward to a fruitful discussion on the topic of fraud. Lynn?
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the fraud session. Since we last met in March, the task force has met 3 times. So we met again in March, April and May. So we've been very busy and we progressed the topics that we dealt with in the March meeting. And we have also new topics to present to you today, namely structure, introduction, specialised skills, presumption of fraud risk and revenue recognition, and journal entries. At the end of the session, I'll give you an update on where we are in terms of enhanced transparency in the auditor's report. And we will also talk, as we talk briefly about which other task forces we've talked to and what other outreach we've done. The structure of this morning's session is Sally Ann will start, then Jesper will take over and take us through the 315 information. I'll do all the questions plus the second half of the day, and Hankin will be our master of note-taking. So thank you, Hankin, for that. Can I in particular thank those 3 people, Sally Ann, Jesper and Hankin, for the enormous amount of great work you've put in during the last 3 months to get us to this point. And can I salute the task force, Diane, Josephine, Lynn and Julie, and they will come in at points in time as they see fit with any comments. My prediction for this morning is Diane will talk about journal entries. So thanks to all of you for reading the papers, and we're very much going to welcome your input over the morning. So with that brief introduction, it's my pleasure to hand over to Sally Ann, who's going to talk to us about the structure of 240 revised.
Thank you very much, Lynn, and it's an honour to be here today. Hopefully everybody can hear me. So I'll be presenting a few sections today, the first being the structure of the proposed ISA 240. The structure is laid out in paragraph 9 of the issues paper. It's really intended to be a roadmap for us as we progress our revision to the standard. So just to guide you as we make our way through the various sections, I would ask that the board reserve comments on the structure to the specific sections as discussed in the paper. So as we move through the agenda item today, what I would like to note is that as we develop the structure, we did consider the layout, the content, and the various headings of recently issued ISAs. In particular, ISA 315 revised 2019, which I know Jesper will be talking extensively about today, and then ISAs 540 and 600 revised respectively. So that's the overview of the structure. And next slide, please. All right, moving on to the introduction. So what changes did we make to the introduction? Those were obviously driven by the proposed actions as outlined in the project proposal. You can see on the slide we dealt with emphasis on the auditor's responsibilities, the relationships between various ISAs, non-material fraud, and then the task force did deal with some other matters, which I will touch on briefly. So with respect to the emphasis on the auditor's responsibilities regarding fraud, What do we do here? We prominently present the auditor's responsibilities at the outset of the introductory section. The task force felt very strongly that this was important as it sets the overall tone and focus of the standard. We also introduced a section, key concepts in this ISA, and we reduced the ambiguity between the inherent limitations of an audit and the auditor's responsibilities, in part by moving the inherent limitations under the new key concept section. We also clarified the relationships between the ISAs, and we accomplished this by using headings. We also explicitly mentioned some of the key ISAs, and we leveraged the newly released non-authoritative guidance to explain some of those interrelationships. Next, with respect to non-material fraud, we highlighted that when determining whether fraud is material or not material, the auditor needs to focus on both the qualitative and quantitative characteristics that give rise to the identified misstatements. So we welcome feedback, particularly on that aspect today. Other matters addressed by the task force revolved around the term fraud. We felt that we wanted to clarify what was meant at the outset by that term, and that the auditor is concerned with both actual fraud that has been perpetrated, as well as suspected fraud that could cause a material misstatement in the financial statements. We believe this is no change from extant, but we merely wanted to clarify and highlight that perspective. Further, we also clarified the linkage between ISA 240 proposed and ISA 315 revised 2019 to explain the interrelationship between the inherent risk factors and the fraud risk factors. That's in paragraph 8B. And we also wanted to address that deficiencies in an entity's system of internal control may provide opportunities for fraud to be committed and may also be an indicator that fraud risk factors are present. So those are the highlights in the introductory section that we wanted to share with you today. And with that, I will pass it back to you, Lynn.
Thank you, Sally Ann. Next slide, please. Okay, given the fact that question 2 is the same on every question slide, I'm just going to mention it once, but look forward to any comments you have in relation to anything else in terms of each question as we go through. In this particular section and from the project proposal, a good introduction was considered to be a really important part of this revision. So we are interested in particular, obviously generally about anything, but in terms of the introductory paragraphs, but in particular, have we got the appropriate balance? What do you think of the key concepts section? As Sally Ann's talked about, those issues that are not material, have we got that right? And do you agree with us defining fraud to be inclusive of actual and suspected fraud? So with that, Tom, I'll hand back to you for the first round of questions. Thank you.
Thank you. I should also welcome Wolf to the table. Hopefully Kai had a safe flight back to Germany last night. Okay, we'll take comments on question 1. Sachiko.
Good morning, everybody. And thank you very much, Ling and Sally and your team. I think this project is really, very important in terms of public interest. So I really appreciate your hard work. And with regard to introduction, I have 3 comments. The first comment is on the second sentence of paragraph 4C. I agree with the first sentence to clarify that the auditor is concerned with both actual fraud and also suspected fraud. But I do not think the second sentence is necessary, which says the term fraud is intended to include both actual fraud and suspected fraud unless otherwise indicated. Because I think if we want to use the term fraud as both actual as well as suspected fraud, we need to be really careful when using the term fraud, because especially when we think about responses to the assess risk of fraud, the requirement and application material have to be developed carefully to distinct clearly whether it applies to both actual fraud and suspected fraud or only to either, because the key area for auditor to consider could be different by them. So by adding the sentence, I'm a little bit concerned that we may have unintended consequences and make the standard confusing. So my suggestion is remove this sentence. And if we need to distinguish the requirement and the related application material for actual and suspected fraud, I think we should use the term fraud to mean actual fraud rather than introducing the new term actual fraud in addition to fraud and suspected fraud. And my second comment is paragraph A1 big B. I think it is originally in the introduction section itself, but I think considering the importance of the responsibility of those charged with governance, I think this paragraph should not be removed to the application material. And my last comment is paragraph 8 big C. For me, it's very obvious explanation. So I wonder whether it's really needed. That's my last comment. Thank you very much.
Okay, Sue?
Thanks. So I think Sachiko has my notes. I had the same comment about the use of suspected fraud. I think it's absolutely appropriate in many circumstances, but in some we are probably talking about fraud. And I was trying to work through the kind of how this would impact other ISAs and the kind of what would be done differently. So I as I say, very similar observations to Sachiko. In terms of the overall the structure and things, I think a lot of what you've done is really clarifying and very helpful. So I like moving the section on inherent limitations and the subheadings and so on. I did have a reservation about moving the auditor's responsibilities before management's, simply because the management and those charged with governance, it sets the whole scene around the overall responsibilities in relation to fraud before we then dig into the auditor responsibilities in relation to the audit of the financial statements. So that contextual piece I felt was more valuable first. And I think that it's maybe clearer now that you've moved some of the inherent limitation stuff through. So I'd just ask you to take a look at that. Thank you.
Wolf?
Thank you. Kai asked me to convey 4 different comments to the introductory section. The first relates to paragraph 1B. Kai understands why we've separated the responsibility section from the inherent limitations, but there seems to be something missing. It's a bit naked, because if you look at ISA 200, it does, the section there connects the inherent limitations to the requirement on sufficient appropriate audit evidence and reasonable assurance. And so while the inherent limitations don't reduce the responsibility, they do have an impact on what you can do. And so there needs to be, his first reaction says move paragraph 1B back, but I guess he's okay as long as you make a better connection to the inherent limitations without in any way suggesting that it reduces the responsibilities. The second comment, very much like Sachiko and Sue, concern about when we are using suspected fraud. When we're talking, for example, risk of material misstatement due to fraud, I think we mean real fraud and not suspected fraud. So there were some concerns about using the term throughout as meaning fraud and suspected fraud. Another major issue in this respect was the distinction between fraud and suspected fraud and the risk of material misstatement due to fraud. When do you move from the risk of material misstatement due to fraud to suspected fraud, and from there to identified fraud? So there was a thought that it might be helpful to provide some guidance as to what the distinctions are. The third issue was a question whether 4D is in the right place The question was whether it really ought to be in the section dealing with identified misstatements of fraud rather than the introductory section. And in paragraph 6, in particular, the application material, Kai took the view that we should add something about the actual inherent limitations that auditors are subject to. We talk about concealment in A5A, or collusion, but collusion is one of the more difficult things to uncover because auditors don't have the ability to require the entity or third parties to disgorge documents or seize documents and records. They don't have the ability to question parties from within the entity or third parties under oath. So those are sorts of things that auditors cannot do, and they're directly relevant to things like forgery and collusion. Those were Kai's comments. Thank you.
Thank you. We've gotten some pretty consistent feedback from the early respondents on actual versus suspected fraud. I would also encourage people to feel free to talk on either side of the issue, but if people have an different point of view on it too, I'd like to make sure we get a real discussion on this point, because we'll have to give the staff and the task force some guidance here. Okay, next up is Edo.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Lynn, Celia, and Jesper, Hanken, everybody who was involved with getting us the papers. It's great to see the progress made on this important topic. I'm generally okay with the introduction. I have a couple of comments, and I will send some further more drafting comments and questions in. But I had a comment in respect of 1B, where we now say the misstatement resulting from fraud may be higher than the risk of not detecting one resulting from error. I'm not sure why we changed the may from is. I think it is. I also wonder whether we now need to change all the auditors' reports, because I think that language is carried over there, and whether that was intended. So I was just questioning why that was changed. And in respect of C, I guess I'm okay with the responsibilities, but and I guess you will at some later stage address the project proposal element in this respect, is what the auditor does when he does encounter a non-material fraud. That's correct? Yeah? Okay, so those were my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Fernando?
Thank you, Tom, and thanks, Lane Task Force, for the papers. I'm also in support of how you structure this first part. The only comment I have here in my notes is, are we going too far with suspected, which is similar to what others mentioned. Thanks.
Wendy?
Thank you, Tom. And thank you for your recommendation not to pile on, but to send in some pointed recommendations to the task force, which we will do. I'd like to thank the task force. I think you did an excellent job. The papers were great. Task force, IAASB staff, and the board members who helped. Broadly, well, what's in the introduction, we agree with. The order was sometimes challenging, and we tried to step back and say, does it really matter if it's digital? The order, the content is important, and the linkage is important. So we can make some recommendations on how to perhaps link it better. Quite concerned about the unintended consequences, and yes, this is piling on, of replacing all instances of fraud or suspected fraud, how it links through other standards, what the real intention is. Are we sort of slipping in this suspicious mindset that we, as a board, said we didn't want in the standard? And we, so all of those concerns. And probably the most the most, in the structure, the only thing that I thought we should change is the audit, where the auditor's responsibility is placed, despite talking about that it's going to be digital. And I think that's it. Thank you.
I have a question right now, maybe again, since everyone's consistent so far on the suspected fraud issue, maybe is there anyone who plans to speak who has a different point of view on this? Bill?
Yeah, that's why I raised my card, to give an alternative view. I quite like the use of suspected fraud, and I think I don't think it's going to lead to any unintended consequences, and I don't think you could ever not consider suspected fraud as part of your examination. So I'm strongly the other way.
Maybe it would be useful, again, I think the task force ultimately will need to get guidance from this board. And so I'm pausing on this issue. Maybe someone from the task force could reiterate what the thought process was here. And then maybe we're going to need to give you some guidance, I'm certain, on this one, because we've heard a lot. I assume the task force agrees, but maybe some context, and maybe that will generate some conversation about the suspected fraud issue.
I'm going to hand to Sally Ann to address that.
Thank you very much, Lynn. I think when we initially looked at it, we had some discussions around this, and we thought it very important to clarify, because of the discussion we're having right now. It is in the objective. So objective, whatever, 11C says to respond appropriately to fraud or suspected fraud identified during the audit. It does pop up intermittently throughout the standard, yes, in inappropriate places, but we also wanted to make sure that we were clear that when we were talking about fraud, that we were talking about both, because of the context as provided in the objective. I would also just respond to Sachiko's comment. Yes, we will be addressing procedures. It's part of the project proposal, number 17, where we will be dealing with requirements and application material when fraud is identified or suspected. So that actually came out through the various all the various activities that we did regarding research, and that was one of the proposed actions. So I just want to clarify that. And if any of the other task force members would like to step in on this particular point, that would be appreciated.
Josephine?
Yeah, thank you, Sally Ann, and that's spot on. And I just want to echo what Bill said, which is exactly that point. It is fraud or suspected fraud that you're thinking about throughout the audit, and it's just important to clarify that in the introductory material, because it's not necessarily clear in the extant standard today. Thank you.
Warren, I saw your hand jump up on the. I almost felt like it was the old two-handed. Raising hands, but they don't have that feature on Zoom. So would you like to come in on this specific topic?
Yes, Tom, thanks. I'm with Josephine and Bill on this one. I also thought that the reference to suspected fraud was actually quite helpful. And I don't think it's going to result in unintended consequences. In fact, I thought it solved a bit of a technical conundrum, because the current version of ISA 240 and this proposed version both make it clear that the auditor can't really make the legal determination on whether or not something is or isn't a fraud. That's ultimately the jurisdiction of a court of law. So technically, the auditor is always dealing with suspected fraud, unless, of course, the auditor is dealing with the matter after the fact. So I thought that the reference to suspected fraud was both appropriate and helpful.
Okay, of the hands that are the 10s that are up, who wants to come in? We'll get other input on the rest of the questions right now, but who wants to come in on this exact point? If you show your hand here, Jim.
Warren sort of took my statement, but I think we had some discussions as well, because fraud depends on intent, and I don't know that auditors can determine intent. So therefore, you have to consider suspected fraud. And so I think you do need both elements, or otherwise you would never really have a fraud finding because you could never prove that intent.
Eric?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that in the discussion with my stakeholders, this didn't come up as a concern.
Sachiko?
I'm sorry to come back. Maybe I didn't make my point very clear. I'm fine to use suspected fraud, but my issue is define the term fraud to include both actual and suspected fraud, because the response should be different each other. So that's my comment.
Anyone else want to come in on this specific issue? Shall we?
Thank you. I just want to say that I didn't come with this challenge. I like the reference to suspected fraud, but having heard Sachiko and the rest, it does trigger in my mind whether there would be an unintended consequence of defining it as such. I don't think anyone is questioning referencing to suspected fraud. But to define it and whether there's any consequence throughout the standard, but I'm sure the task force will comb through the standard to make sure that it is all done properly.
Wendy?
All right, thanks. I just wanted to clarify in the same way that Sachiko did, and also what Chun-Wei said. It's not about, suspected fraud is addressed appropriately in the places where it should be. It was the definition of fraud to include fraud and suspected fraud. And then it became very confusing as to how that would cross to the other ISAs or perhaps the opinion. So that would, my comment is the same as Sachiko's, as clarified by Chun-Wei.
Lynn?
It does get incredibly cumbersome if throughout every time we use the word fraud, we have to put actual and suspected fraud. So just it significantly affects the flow and ease of reading the document, which is part of the reason why we defined it up front and used it throughout. So if we move away from this current position, just be aware you're going to end up with a lot more words. And we as a task force found it confusing, which is why we've gone this direction. Yeah, so we'll obviously have to work this through, but just putting that in. Diane, I think you wanted to come in.
Yeah, first of all, it's a very helpful discussion. I think maybe we have a to-do here, Lynn, which is to think about, if you go through the standard, where would you have a different approach? Because I hear everybody, the question is, how are you going to respond? And would you have a difference in how you respond to fraud versus suspected fraud, recognizing Warren's point that, quite frankly, all of it's suspected fraud. But I think we need to take a to-do to go through and say, where would you have a difference? Look at it in totality and say, okay, 95% of the time, you're doing the same thing, whether it's suspected or fraud. So between us, it's not a big deal. Or it's 50-50 and it is worthy of separating it out. So I think that's probably our to-do.
Yeah, what I see this going for you is that the task force has some latitude to continue to utilize the term, but with an eye to unintended consequences. I think for those who were concerned about this topic, that was the point that they were willing, and Diane and you have suggested. I would regret us making a standard more cumbersome. We could define terms as we seek to define them. Sue?
I just wanted to say that I found Warren's explanation really helpful. If there's a way we could capture that somewhere, because then it clarifies it, and that would probably help in the drafting sense as well.
Thank you. Okay. Reset. For those who have the TEDs up, I just want to make sure you have your TEDs up to comment on other issues now. Jim, do you have your TED up? Okay. Chun-Wei.
Thank you, Tom, and good morning, colleagues. I hope everyone stayed dry. So I want to just start by saying thank you so much, Lean and Task Force and Stir, for the fantastic work. I'm a big fan of this project. I always enjoy reading your papers and the amendments, and likewise this time around. So I only have one comment I want to make. I would just say that in terms of the structure, I like many of the things that you've done here. The only piece that I want to flag is actually has been raised by Wolf already, which is the 1B. I think it's important. It's an important reminder, especially in the context of description of the inherent limitation. And I, like Wolf, I do have, and like Kaiwu and Wolf, I do have this question about the connection to the inherent limitation. Because after reading the inherent limitation, I think you somehow need to link it back to this description to make it more fulsome. Thanks.
Thank you. Isabel?
Yes, thank you. So thanks to Lynn and the task force, I will have only few comments today, as the task force has done what you told us you were going to do. So you delivered what we expected, and thank you for that. So my comments on these sections are more on the formatting and more particularly on the drafting style. Maybe there's more to do with the CUSP convention. I noted you referred to CUSP for the choice of words, which I really appreciated. But regarding the style and more particularly the length of the sentences, for example, I looked at 8B and translating it will be a real challenge because you have several words coming back several times. But I understand what it means, but it's just the length and the complexity of translating that kind of sentences. I struggled also with the last two bullets of A4. For me, it's very difficult to understand what we mean. Maybe I struggled with the first word of these two bullets, which is exploiting. Difficult for me to understand what is the idea behind. So there may be something to do on these last two bullets. And finally, on paragraph 9A, I don't find it very useful. It's useful because we say that over ISA may expand on 240. So that you have to do what is in the other ISAs in addition to what is in 240. But we say that other ISAs may also have requirements that apply to fraud. So it's a statement of fact. In fact, it's not a may, it's some ISA have. So it's strange to see a may in this section. And maybe what would be helpful, but I don't know if it's feasible, is to have maybe as an appendix the list of other standards and requirements that have requirements for fraud. I think we have done that in ISA 580, where we have an appendix when we connect to the other standards that require management representation. So maybe we could do that because, okay, there may be some, but where? Well, we have 1,000 pages to read to find them. Thank you.
Thank you. Eric?
Thanks. And yeah, very supportive of the direction being taken on the introduction overall. Only really a couple of comments to add. One that came up, and perhaps we're going to deal with this when you come back to the non-material fraud considerations, but 4D talks about the judgments and dealing with fraud, material fraud, but it doesn't talk to non-material fraud. There were some who were a little bit confused about how in these sort of key concepts, we're talking about the inherent risk factors that are in 315 and why that's needed to be repeated here, whether there's something that could be more specific to fraud in that discussion. Sorry, just quickly looking at my notes. I think that's all I wanted to mention at this point. Thanks.
Hi.
Thank you. I'll keep this short as I'm very happy with the direction that we're moving. And I also think Warren's explanation earlier was really helpful, and I wonder if that somehow could be captured in the standard or application material. I think that could be really helpful for people.
We may have to footnote Warren in the applications. The only other thing I'd say is that I'm really personally really supportive. I thought it's been one of my bugbears, the introduction to the standard. The only thing I would say, and we know that the draft is at an early stage, even make 1B even crisper, because I think these introduction paragraphs set the tone, and having long sentences with while caveated things make it more challenging. So I leave it to the task force to do the drafting, but to the extent that we get shorter declarative sentences in the introduction, that will help us then try to address some of the expectation gap issues that surround the standard, particularly with those outside of the profession. So thank you for that, and thank you for your work on this section. Back to you, Lynn.
Thank you. I heard 3 big points, themes coming through. One was obviously the actual and suspected, and Warren's intervention is obviously popular, so we will look at that. The second was linkages between the section, and the third was around wording and clarity of that wording, which obviously we're in pretty early stages, but we hear you on that and accept that. And for all the other points, we'll take those into account. So with that, we're going to move on, and Sally Ann's going to talk to us about engagement resources.
If you wouldn't mind moving on to the next slide, please, Michelle. Thank you. So here I'm just going to provide a brief overview with respect to engagement resources and what the task force did in this regard. So we added a new requirement to determine how the auditor should determine whether members of the engagement team require specialized skills or knowledge, including forensic skills, and at what stage during the audit. So as identified on the slide here, that those skills or knowledge may be used to perform risk assessment procedures, when you're identifying and assessing your ROMs, designing and performing further audit procedures, and even possibly when you're evaluating the audit evidence obtained. So this requirement supplements the foundational requirements in ISA 220 revised. We took it upon ourselves not to repeat requirements where we could. And in ISA 220 revised, if you'll recall that there is the original requirement to determine that sufficient and appropriate resources are necessary for the audit engagement, and that such resources collectively have the appropriate competence and capabilities. We also added application material that may affect the auditor's determination of whether specialized skills or knowledge are required. And we also described the term forensic skills, which is one of the proposed actions, including that such skills may encompass a range of competencies and experience. So just a brief overview of what we try to accomplish in this particular area, and we open it, and then I turn it back to you.
Thank you very much. Next slide, please. Thank you. On this area, and this was one in the project proposal that we heard was really important, that there are multiple different skills that you can bring to an audit and with fraud. Particularly interested in 2 things in terms of this question. The first one is the requirement, particularly in terms of whether it's scalable and proportionate. And the second issue in terms of we haven't defined forensic skills as a definition, it is described. And we're interested in any feedback in terms of that description. So with that, Tom, I hand to you for the next round.
Okay, questions 3 and 4. Bill.
Look, I really like this section. I think it's a major addition to the to the area. Mine's a general comment about drafting and CUS principles, and I may not get this well expressed, but 16A talks about the use of specialised skills, and then A12A has a number, I think it's about 9 or 10 bullet points about the sorts of circumstances that might drive it. And then A12B, the second sentence is, for many audits, the auditor may determine that the audit engagement does not require specialised skills. So I really get a difficulty understanding, is it more likely or less likely that we're going to use specialised skills? So as I say, it's not a very helpful answer because it all rests on that word many, I guess. So, and this is a point I won't make again today, but it does come through the document later, that there's a lot of application material that gives you the impression that you should be doing a lot more in this regard, but I'm not sure if that necessarily is the intent. So, and that's back to what you said earlier, Tom. I like the short, crisp sentences that make it clear the direction or the emphasis you really want to make clear. So I hope that's helpful.
I don't know if that's worth just responding to in terms of intent, or you want to absorb it for now and go around the table. Yeah, okay. So next is Chun Wei.
Thank you. I'm supportive of what the task force has done in this space. The only one comment I want to make is in the requirement 16A, we refer to whether members of the engagement team require specialized skills. And 220 actually refers to resources collectively. So it includes the engagement team and auditors experts who are not part of the engagement team. So I was just wondering why we exclude the expert by way of the wording in 240. So I see that we refer to expert in A12C, but not sure why it's omitted from the requirement. So there's a question here. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. So just on Bill's point, I actually was okay with A12B. I thought it's important to build proportionality in this, but maybe some wording can be done. I'm not sure how to address Bill's concern.
Okay. Wendy?
Okay, thank you, Tom. A broad comment, which somewhat similar to Bill's, and struggling a bit with how much we bring in from other standards and link to other standards, and then within the standard, which is what I had said earlier. And a little bit about construct, but then I didn't want to get too hung up on that because it's all digital in terms of the standards are not all constructed the same way in terms of key concepts or responsibilities. But again, in a digital world, I'm not sure that matters, but it's difficult to get through when you're reading it. Paper is all we have right now. And so then that gets to 16A, where we're talking, we're referenced 220. And I step back and say, are we creating new requirements in 240 for the specialized skills? Is it clear what could be handled by the engagement team? Are we going to end up in a place where we're always going right to a forensic specialist when perhaps it's not needed? It wasn't all that. It wasn't all that clear as to, are there incremental requirements here, or is it still, are we in 220? And then how do we document that? What our decision is, so that there isn't, so others that are looking at what we're doing aren't thinking that we should have done something that we didn't. And then some detailed recommendations: remove the reference to court of law or legal proceeding from a A12D. And then I think we didn't send comments in advance, probably because you didn't ask for them, but we will send them in after. We try to meet those deadlines. So that's it on this one for now.
Thank you. Sachika?
Thank you. Last time it seems that I have suits note, and it seems that this time Bill have my note. I mean, I have a similar comment with Bill with regard to the second sentence of paragraph 812. Big B. I stumble across because it seems to dilute the requirement itself. And I understand, like Chung-Wee, it tried to address the issue of scalability, proportionality. But for me, proportionality is already addressed in the requirement itself this time. So maybe I think this sentence is not necessary. That's my view. Thank you.
Thank you. Kai?
Thank you. Continuing on that list of who's has whose notes, I think I agree with Sachiko's point that I don't think that last sentence is necessary. I also did have some concerns or question with drafting style because we seem to referring to the other standards and whether we really are adding a requirement or just reminding what already is in 220. And also as Chung-Wee said, we don't mention experts in 16A, while in the application material we do, and more of a question there, why, or is it intended or not?
Isabel.
Yes, I'm supportive of the direction. On 16A, and my point may be similar to the one that was raised by Chung-Wee, that I went to the paragraph 26 of ISA 220, which has a footnote, but it's not written at all the same way. When you go to paragraph 26 of 220, it says the engagement partner shall determine that member of the engagement team have the appropriate competence and capabilities. So it's not at all the engagement team requires specialized skills and knowledge. It's totally the other way around. So maybe if we want to refer specifically to this paragraph, we need to use the same construction. And it will be also easier in the translation and easier to understand. We are not building something different than what is intended by ISA 220. On the bulleted list of A12A, I believe that some of the situations described are not that complex and do not require always specialized skills and technique. For example, the one of complexity or the organizational structure and related party relationship may not require extended forensic skills. Maybe a normal auditor can do that. We are very supportive of A12B and especially the last sentence. Not convinced we should remove it. I think it's important for scalability because sometimes we need to state the obvious. So it was an interesting addition to have it here. And regarding A12D, so which is the kind of definition of forensic skills. In fact, it's not a definition, it's a development of what it may include. So it's challenging because as we are in the application material, we have to use may. But if we use may, it means it's not necessarily what we mean. It may also include something else. So the fact that it's in the application material and not as a definition makes it more challenging. And when we look at the last sentence of the first paragraph of A12D, so it's the introduction to the bulleted list, and we say may include competence and experience, and we would like to add enhanced experience and competence, because the auditor is already required to have experience and competence in assessing fraud risk and in all the other topics we mentioned. But what we need when we require forensic skills, it's extended competence on that domain. Thank you.
Thank you. Sue?
Thank you. I realised I was remiss at the beginning in not thanking the task force for all the work. I think this is a great piece of work. I had expressed concerns previously about scalability in this kind of area, and I like what you've done in the way of the structuring and sort of ultimately leading to a reference to forensic specialists. So possibly I disagree a bit with Isabel in that I feel that what we've got is scalable and capable of being considered in different kind of ways. I've got a few detailed things which I'll send through, but there's nothing major there, and I do think that it's a good description. The overall comment is around the use of determine, because in that scalability piece, as others have pointed out, you've got A12B, which suggests that often the conclusion will be that specialists aren't needed, or that specialist skills aren't needed. And I do think that's an important statement from a scalability perspective. But if you play that back, what we're saying is we're actually, through using the word determine, introducing a documentation requirement into a lot of audits for which it will be highly unlikely that would be a major consideration. So I guess I'm not strongly in favour of determine.
Edo, you want to come in on that point?
Yes, and just to emphasize my support for the use of determine. I like the fact that it introduces a documentation requirement, and that there's now a requirement to think about it and to document why you did or did not involve specialized skills.
Anyone else? Fernando?
Thank you, Tom. Just to express my support, I like the requirement and the application material. I don't really see any challenge understanding what the task force is trying to write here and for us to execute that. Thanks.
Diane, I think you wanted to return to Edo's point.
I had a question if I could, and I appreciate, because we did struggle with determine versus consider. Is there an appetite to have determine be applicable to only certain entities, like listed entities? Because I'm also just thinking of the broad brush. I don't know, maybe not. I just throw that out there.
Janine?
Thanks. Yeah, I'd like to make a remark that I'd like to make an encouragement for the board to also think about what it will mean in practice. So do auditors make different decisions? We want to actually make sure that auditors are better able in also detecting suspected frauds, etc. So then I understand that there are different things to consider, like scalability and so on, but I also would like to encourage you all to think about, will it really drive different choices that are made during audits? And I think this is also an important aspect, specialized skills, to be better able to see where there could be suspected frauds situations in audits. So I'd like to make that comment now. So thanks.
So, Josephine, you were about to raise your card and then you put it back down. Did you want to come in?
Well, I think it was just to say that what we're trying to do here, and it was picked up, is by Isabel. We possibly have the wrong footnote here, but we are trying to obviously mirror or echo what we have in 220, and that is a determination that sufficient and appropriate resources are. And then the point that we were asked to address in the project proposal was this specialized skills piece. And so from my perspective, I personally feel as a member of the task force, it is in the right spot. But maybe there was a point about aligning the wording a little bit better. So maybe there is something we can do there to help that connection to 220.
I guess I didn't hear any violent reaction to the general principle here. And again, this always goes early stage drafting and allow the task force to consider. Lynn, that's the last of the hands for this round.
Yeah, my summary of what I heard in terms of 3A was a general agreement with the fact that we have a requirement, which is positive. Some question of whether it should be determined, different opinions on that, but on balance, it sounded like determine was okay for, as an issue, and that we have actually addressed scalability and proportionality. But once again, there's some clarity of wording, And I'm sympathetic to where we are circular in terms of cross-referencing. So hear that. And not many people mention the forensic skills description, but those that did were largely supportive. So my conclusion on this is we're heading in the right direction, just need to do some tidying up to get the clarity. So with that, we will move on to the next slide, which is Jasper is going to talk about 315 as our resident expert in this area. Thanks, Jasper.
Thank you, Lynn. Yes, I will walk you through the sections of proposed ISO 240 revised that are building off ISO 315 revised 2019. So the task force started with the alignment. So in revising 315, conforming amendments were made already to ISO 240, but it was recognized that more could be done to straighten the relationship between these two standards. So therefore, proposed action was included in the project proposal to enhance and clarify requirements and application material in ISO 240 to incorporate the recent changes resulting from 315. So that's what we're working on. On this slide are some of the more general things that we've done and that you will see come through throughout the sections that relate to 315. So you'll see this come back in a section on the risk assessment procedures, on obtaining an understanding, and the section on identifying and assessing the risk of material misstatement. So the things that we've been doing so far is the alignment of the wording, the structure, and the headings. We also clarified the linkage with 315 by using the phrase in applying ISO 315 revised 2019 if a requirement was building off a foundational requirement in 315. So it's similar wording that was used in 600 and also by the CASP guidance. It's included in there, so that's probably not surprise you. The other thing that we did is that we clarified that the risk assessment procedures in 240 refer to and expand on what was included in 315. This was one of the proposed actions in the project proposal. That's why we included application material in paragraph A12E. Michelle, if you can go to the next slide. So this next slide deals with the risk assessment procedures section, which also includes some of the communications with those charged with governance. So here in this section, we made, if you look at it, we made a lot of changes to align with 315. So I won't go through those in detail. The task force also discussed what the specific fraud considerations are in this area and therefore made several changes. The main ones are the following. We included a new requirement for specific discussions with those charged with governance about fraud-related matters. Again, this was a proposed action in the project proposal, and the goal of that is to encourage two-way communication between those charged with governance and the auditor. We also developed application material that explains the importance of effective two-way communications, and we provided examples illustrating matters that could be discussed with those charged with governance. And these matters in the application material are based on requirements and application material in ISO 260 revised. We also added a new requirement to determine the implications when there are inconsistent responses to the inquiries between management and those charged with governance, individuals within the internal audit function, and others within the entities, because there are all requirements there for the auditor to do inquiries with these others as well. Then if we go like on the right hand side of the slide, you see information from other sources. Like in the project proposal, there was also an action item included on this. The task force recognized that 315 already includes a requirement related to this, and it's to consider information from the acceptance and continuance, and also from other engagements performed by the engagement partner. So we discussed what could be the special consideration related to fraud, and we came out that it was mainly related to matters in accordance with ISO, of the procedures that the auditors performed in accordance with ISO 720 revised, Furthermore, the application material also highlights some other sources of information. For example, engagement team discussion. So, Lynn, with that, I hand it back over to you. And Michelle, you can go to the next slide.
Thanks, Jesper. What we have done with questions 5 and 6, and actually it's question 5, you will see this repeated ongoingly as Jesper goes through 315. We've just divided it into bits. So in this question, we're asking for feedback on paragraphs 17 to 24 and A12E to A23A. And the specific question is, do we need anything further to clarify the risk assessment procedures in 240 and that they're not separate from those in 315? This is a section that we're still work in progress. It's one of the major sections of the fraud standard. But we are interested in where we've got to. Is that enough? Is it too much? Doesn't it resonate with you? So with that, Tom, I turn back to you for the next round of questions.
Thank you. Anyone want to come in here? Guess you guys got it just perfect. Wendy.
So I'll come in and I'll send some comments offline. I think the objectives or what we talked about in the project proposal have been met. The concern I have is, are we doing 2 different risk assessments, or, did we bring, I understand what we brought in, but does it imply that there are 2 different risk assessments and maybe we should focus on just what's incremental in 240, but still sticking with the spirit and the order in 315? Or the other, so that was one comment. And then I wasn't really clear on the reference to 720 and the requirement in 24, but I'm not, oh yeah, 24 is here. Sorry. Just needed to find my place. Sorry, I can't find it, so I will send it offline.
Wolf.
Kai asked me to convey a number of comments. He first had a general comment on the section that he felt that the level of granularity or redundancy with respect to 315, I guess maybe this echoes what Wendy was saying as well. It looked like we were doing a separate assessment from 315, and there were a number of requirements like 24B, 26, 28A, where the question was simply asked, do we need to state this? And simply drop error was what it looked like. And maybe there's another way of handling it, maybe like in 600. Let's see, go to the next comment. In paragraph 24B, F, we seem to have introduced a new threshold.
I think that's the next section. We're up to 24.
Okay, not 24B. Okay.
Okay, we'll get back to it. So we know you're coming in on the next time. Foreshadowing.
Yes, thank you. Up to 24. So I think my key question I had was with respect to 24 itself. When we say other sources, but other from what? I just was unclear on what other was, and there's an example in respect of other information in accordance with ISO 720, or that's much later on in the process. So I was wondering whether the information from the acceptance and continuance would be a better example in this context. I think that's. And yes, so in respect of the inquiries of those charged with governance and management, I was just wondering whether we could also include something in respect of the company's fraud risk assessment. So why don't we ask those charged with governance what they think of management's fraud risk assessment as an example, also to drive the ecosystem aspect of this? Thank you.
Thank you. Kai?
Thank you. I'm sympathetic with Wendy and Wolf and Kai-Uwe on the, it seems like we're creating additional assessment. And I think that's also maybe going to the scalability, because then for the lesser complex entities, it seems to be adding a lot of documentation requirements in practice. So thanks.
Eric?
Thanks, Tom. And ditto the comment about 315 and the linkages there, and I guess we'll come back in a bit more detail shortly. I just had a couple of comments, really. One was on the requirement in 17. I wondered, it says the auditor shall perform the procedures in paragraphs A17A to 24B to obtain audit evidence. And I wondered if that should say design and perform, because presumably you have to design them appropriately, and that's an important feature. The other one I had was on 22B, where there are inconsistent responses. And it says the auditor shall determine the implications for the identification and assessment of the risks of material misstatement. And I just wondered if that was too narrow, because I can imagine it might have, if you're getting inconsistent responses to inquiries from these different parties, it might not just be affecting the identification and assessment of risks. It might affect other things beyond identification and assessment of risks. So I just wondered if you wanted to think about if that's the appropriate action to take. Those are my two comments on that. Thanks.
Ida, you want to come back?
Yes, on that last point that Eric made, I think we're solving that in 500 now, aren't we, Eric, with the inconsistencies and doubts?
Wendy?
I just wanted to come back in on 24 and be clear. The requirement is right. I just don't think I don't think 720 should be referred to in the requirement. It should be covered in application material along with Ado's comment about client acceptance and continuance.
Chun-Wei?
Thank you. So first of all, the overarching comment around this, the interaction with 315, I have the same concern. I know that we're still working through this, and I know 24B is later on, but I think especially 24B, there seems to be a lot of unnecessary duplication there. So I'm sure the task force will be working through to tighten that. A small comment on 22. I think when we say in applying 315 or whichever reference, usually have a footnote. I don't. Maybe there's a footnote missing there. And then 22B. 22B, I think it's the same comment as Eric and Ado. The alignment with 500. In 500, we do have 2 steps, and one of which is to understand and address the inconsistency. So I wonder if there's something that needs to be done there. To Eric's point, this seems to be quite limited. And just want to make one last comment, which is relating to the issues paper. One of the things pending is, the fraud, the scalability bit, coming up with potentially examples that are more specific to LCEs. And I think from the LCE project, we do hear that stakeholders are asking for such more specific requirements or guidance. So I think that would be really helpful for that coordination. Thank you.
Thank you. I see no other hands. So back to you, Lynn.
Yeah, it seems to me that we haven't been clear enough, obviously, in terms of the risk assessment procedures. If you're all thinking that there's 2 assessments, because it is an integrated part of 315 with a fraud lens applied to it. So it's getting that balance right. So that's incredibly useful feedback. In terms of the 720 issue, which seems to have come up several times, we'll obviously look at whether there's a better example that we can use there. Ada, I thought we actually had that point about those charged with governance and asking them about management's assessment. I can't find the exact section, but if we haven't got it, we'll certainly look at that because it's sensible. And yes, scalability, obviously, Chung Wei is something that we need to build into this section because doing your risk assessment in a multinational company compared with a very small audit can be very different, and we don't want to have unreasonable documentation requirements at that lower end. So we will certainly look at that. So some work to do, but very useful input. Yes, but you might be able to help people with why we put 720 in before you move to the next slide.
I think it was just generally used as to cover everything related to other information. So that's why that reference to 720 was in. We didn't put the acceptance and continuance in because that's already included in 315. That's why we didn't have that. So we try to have the fraud lens on this one as well. But I take the points from the board that we need to look at it.
Okay, Lynn, I think back to you.
Okay, we can move on to the next slide. Yes, but thanks.
Yeah, so we're moving now to obtaining an understanding. This is an area that needed to be developed significantly. We basically had to start from scratch as Extent 240 didn't have such a section. So therefore, there was a proposed action item in the project proposal again. And this section is still partly work in progress. The requirement is drafted and the application material related to the entity and its environment and the applicable financial reporting framework as well. But there's still work to do on a lot of work to do on the entity system of internal control. There, the application material. So that we will be doing that for the December meeting. So with respect to the requirement, the task force discussed the structure of this requirement. We recognize it's really long, and that we might need to do something on that as well, because right now it's a long requirement. It's fairly similar to what we use with 540, with having subheadings in there. ISO 600 also has a very long requirement related to obtaining an understanding, but there a different construct was used. The task force was on balance of the view that the construct in 540 worked better, because otherwise you would have a lot of sub bullets, and we thought using the headers was clearer. But again, like with the caveat that we're going to look at this further and interest as well on the board's thought on the structure of the requirement. The task force also discussed we really discussed what are the fraud specific matters that we need to be highlighted here, and John Wee alluded to this already in his comment. Like for some of the matters that are included, they are not fraud specific. But we thought they were needed to have a hook to have application material. So this is, for example, the case with the industry. So 24B and then small b. So the requirement is exactly is very similar to what is in 315, doesn't include a specific consideration related to fraud. But the application material explains how the understanding of the industry assists the auditor in identifying fraud risk factors. The application material, in developing that, we used various sources because we had to start from scratch. So we went back to the project proposal, we went back to the March issues paper that included several suggestions. Also used CPAP's thematic review that they recently published on fraud, and also all the things that we got for examples from that we used. And if the board has any further examples, we're really interested in that as well. As mentioned, we're still working on the application material of the entity system of internal control. We did include their placeholders already for some sections that give the direction that we're thinking of developing application material for. And I think that's it for this section as an introduction, Lynn. So over to you.
Thank you, Jesper. And can we have the next slide, please? We have deliberately just dealt with 24B and the application material in this question because it's such a significant part of the changes we're making. And so we are interested at this point not in the wording of the particular requirements or the application material, but in the structure and where it started. So this is definitely work in progress. We accept that, but does the structure resonate with you? And is there anything that you looked at and went, that doesn't work? I don't like that. That bit's great. Or why on earth are they doing that? So it's at that level we're looking at, rather than I don't like this particular requirement or this piece of application material at this point. We're not there yet. We will get there at the next meeting, but we're not there yet. So that's the flavour of the discussion that we would find useful at this point in time. Thanks, Tom.
Okay, we'll heed Lynn's request here. All right. So if you start wordsmithing, you may get the mic may cut out on you. Bill.
I certainly won't wordsmith. You mentioned that it is a long 24B is a long requirement, and I think it's right, and I like the structure, so that's a plus. But then the application material, and again, it's not complete, is quite extensive. And I just, again, coming back to the principles of drafting, it seems to be getting away from principles based in the application material and you're trying too hard, I think, to cover everything. So my suggestion would be to reduce that rather than try. Haven't finished it yet, but I don't want to sort of demotivate the very, very good work you've done to try and provide some guidance.
Okay, Wolf, I can't resist calling on you now because I know you wanted to come in earlier.
Thank you, Tom. With reference to the previous comment that I had made on Kai's behalf, also in 24B, the question was whether you can get rid of some of the redundancy by just referring to the requirement in 315 rather than repeating it word for word everything that's there. And I think you can still hang off the appropriate application material. Without trying to get into wordsmithing, Kai did express concern about 24BF, where we seem to be introducing a new threshold for which a risk of fraud is likely to exist. We probably need to go back to where risks of fraud exist or where a material misstatement due to fraud is reasonably possible or somewhere along those lines. Shouldn't be introducing a new threshold.
I didn't feel the need to cut off your mic for that last remark. Fernando.
Thank you, Tom. And Lynn, I think Wolf mentioned the word duplication, and that's pretty much how I would summarize my comments. Struggling really to jump from 315 to 240 and really picture clearly what we need to do. The only question, and I understand it's still work in progress, but I do see the term of understanding, but I didn't really see anything about evaluation. So I was just wondering if evaluating would be probably included, yes, next version, or it's something that is not considered at all.
Okay, thank you. Kai?
Thank you. I have the same comment as earlier with the reference and linkage to 315, and do wonder though if some of this is better placed in 315 than pulling it out here, because we do have the difficulty of referring back and forward all the time. So that's a bigger question, I know, but then some of this could eventually have gone there.
Ida?
Yes, thank you. And yeah, don't want to be piling on, but I will.
With some delight, it seems.
I hear you, Jasper, and the task force that you need a hook and that you want to follow the same structure, but I think there's a risk that the emphasis is missed as a result. Because I did a contrast and compare with what's already in 315 and what's here and sort of struck out and what was added. And I think it will help auditors when it's abundantly clear what's incremental. And I think that is what this should focus on. From a methodology point of view, this all gets piled into one working program. This is what you do in the planning phase. So that will all merge there anyway, but would be good if those incremental aspects can be focused on, because that will really change the behavior. If it's just a sentence changed a little bit, I think it gets lost on the people why that is actually different. So that was. So my suggestion would be to be much clearer in what's incremental and not repeat what's already there. And I had the same comment as Fernando. It's just the evaluating whether bit I was missing as well. I was wondering, is this coming later or when? Or yeah.
Len, I see you fiddling with your card. Did you want to follow on Edo's point?
Yeah, thank you, Edo, and also a lot of comments about repetition. I think this is one area we spend a lot of time in the task force. So I think Jasper laid it out in his presentation. And also, I think Sally Ann also mentioned at the beginning, is we look at the formatting 540 and 600. And from that perspective, we just finished 600. And Josephine's on a task force, and we would consider what's the best way to present this. Because of public interest comments we heard about the linkage between 315 and the standards, and 315 being a new standard. So we thought, follow that path, having more in the standards. But if there's something that you want the 600 format versus 540 format, we'll definitely take it back. But I thought just explain to that the reason why we did it that way. Thank you.
Okay, Sue?
Thank you.
Did you have your temp back up on the point? Okay, I didn't want to interrupt the exchange here. Okay, Sue? That's
fine, and it's probably piling on to Edo's piling on. I had very, very similar comments. I think 24B is quite detailed, and I also feel it should point to the requirements in 315, but not necessarily repeat them, so that 240 is focusing on the incremental changes. And Len, your comment about 315 being new is interesting, but of course, by the time we get to 240, 315 may not be as new. And certainly once we're a few years down the line, maybe there's something to keep in mind there. I'll obviously save my nice comments about the appendix until we talk about the application material, because we're not talking about drafting or anything like that. But I thought there was some really good context there. I thought the structure worked well in the application material, but I did wonder, given the length of it, whether there might be some that you might want to include in an appendix or something like that rather than the detail. But I thought great material there. Thank you.
Thanks. So, Chun-Wei?
So I've said what I wanted to say, but I feel motivated to pound on after hearing what Edo have said, because I think he expressed what I wanted to express in a much more eloquent way. So just want to echo what he has mentioned. And I think a little bit to Bill's point about the content, I think there are a lot of really good content in the requirement and the application material already, even though it's just a WIP. And I wonder if everything needs to be in the AM or requirement, or, you know, just thinking about what would best change behavior, what would best support practitioner. Is it guidance? Is it appendix? You know, maybe think a little bit more creatively about how we want this material to be packaged and delivered to support the execution. Thanks.
Okay, Wendy, is your 10?
And I won't pile on, there's been plenty of that, but I have obviously the same concern about incremental versus what's in 315. And just to expand a little bit on what Sue said, by the time 240 is out, 315 won't be new, and maybe we needed just to step back to determine whether or not we need changes in 315 and not necessarily make conforming changes or changes to 315 through 240. And then my last observation, and where I get hung up a lot in all of this, is will this reduce the expectation? You know, what we're doing, this is my step back, will it reduce the expectation gap and improve performance? So those are just my 3 points.
Okay, I guess the only real risk about the 315 thing is you open the potential to open a Pandora's box here there. It may be out for some time, but it's still in its infancy. I would think from a standard standpoint. But you got very consistent feedback here, which is what you were seeking. I don't think anyone's debating the linkages to 315. It's just sort of the how-to, and I think those remarks where people were nodding around the head is like what we're all about is the incremental behavioral change that we're trying to seek here. So I think that's good guidance for the task force. But Lynn, maybe I'll turn it back to you for your assessment.
I will make an assessment, but before I do, I think it's a really important point about whether we're going to make the changes in 315 or 240, because it changes the project significantly if we're opening up 315. And I'd just like to pause on this before we move forward, before I summarise on 240, because I have a reasonably strong opinion that we should be working in 240, not opening up 315 and going back to it, because that actually is a significantly different than the project proposal. So I'm just putting it on the table to see if there is an appetite for us changing 315 now rather than 240, or whether that is a comment about doing it at the edges rather than fundamentally.
Okay. I guess you sort of got my preference on this. Is there anyone who is strong inclination to reopen 315 right now? I see nods. No, okay, I think you're talking about. I guess we don't preclude the opportunity that you'll have to have conformity and consequential amendments on this, but where no one's talking about reopening 315 in total. I see Diane, who raised the initial point on that. She's okay, saying I'm okay with it.
What I'm thinking is, I mean, it would have to, in my mind, it would have to be something like a fatal flaw that we've done a body of work, we've looked at it, and we said, you know what, whoops, there was a fatal flaw. That's my threshold to reopen 315.
Okay, it's like never say never, but
yeah,
we're trying to say nearly never.
Yeah, I think that was a really important stake in the ground, though, that we needed from this discussion. So thank you. What I heard was people were quite happy with the structure of what we've done in 24B, but the content needs to be incremental and it needs to be shorter and sweeter. That's what I heard. Wolf, we will be coming to you for the techniques for how we get our application material in without the hook into the requirement. So thank you for that offer. It will be accepted. And the other thing I think we need to ensure is that we don't over cross-reference. I think it's one of the complicators is when you over cross-reference, and there was certainly a sense of that coming through the discussion. So I think they were the major points I wanted to pause on. So with that, Tom, shall we continue?
We shall.
Excellent. Jesper, back to you.
Michelle, can we go to the next slide? Oh, this is the last section that relates to 315. Here we started to address some of the proposed actions, but also some others. We are still we'll consider those later. For example, we still need to do more work on how the fraud risk factors influence the identified ROMs due to fraud. So what we've done so far, to align with 315, we split the requirement that was an extent 240 about identifying and assessing the risk of material misstatement into two requirements, is paragraph 26 and 28. And we also added a new requirement to evaluate the audit evidence obtained from risk assessment procedures. So this is similar to the requirement in 315, but we still need to build it out with application material on fraud specific matters. So the biggest change in the application material here is that we added a paragraph that highlights classes of transactions, account balances, or disclosures that may be particularly susceptible to material misstatements due to fraud. So in the this was one of the proposed actions that we had. There's a lot of focus on fraud and revenue recognition, which we will discuss later. The task force, just generally the point was made that it's good to focus as well on other accounts balances and class of transaction disclosures that may have an increased risk of fraud. So that's why we included that paragraph in this section, because it was broader than just the presumption of fraud and revenue recognition. So with that, I think we can go to the questions, Lynn.
Thanks, Jesper. Next slide, please. Okay, on this one, and this is where we're getting into the evaluating part that we were talking about in the last section. So what we're interested here is on views on paragraph 25, 26, 27A, 28A, and just a note that we will come to the presumption of fraud risk and revenue recognition next. So this is just concluding the 315 ROM area before we move on to some more specific areas. So any comments of any kind or anything we're missing in terms of the risk of identifying and assessing the risks of material misstatement due to fraud? Thanks, Tom.
Okay, we're going to 25 and 26, 27A and 28A. Edo?
Yeah, I'm a little patchy on my notes, but I think it's 28A where I had expected an example of goodwill. And maybe you could give that some thought.
Lynn?
Can I respond to that? Goodwill is probably an example that we're going to scatter quite through this because it's actually a really good example for fraud. So it's not necessarily everywhere it needs to be yet, but we do intend to.
Thank you. Wendy?
Thank you. I actually have only two small comments on this section. 28, the application materials. So 831B, in the introduction, I'm just wondering if we're missing the word internal as it relates to internal controls, not just controls. And so therefore I didn't think 831B was clear either. And I don't know if that's deliberate to leave out the word internal.
Okay. Wolf?
I asked me to bring one point with respect to paragraph 28 and A32, where he believes that it might be helpful to further augment paragraph A32 by further clarifying that that the fact that all assessed risks of material misstatement due to fraud are significant risks doesn't mean that all risks of misstatement, without the word material, due to fraud are significant risks, because management may often choose to accept immaterial fraud as a cost of doing business, because the cost of the controls needed to prevent or detect such fraud may exceed the cost of the fraud.
Okay. Is that a straight end? Okay. I think that's, for those who did speak, I assume you're in general support of the approach of the task force on these paragraphs. Okay, so you got a couple of suggestions, but you got broad support. Back to you, Lynn.
Thank you. We'll take those into account. And Jesper, thank you very much for your presentations. That was great. We're now going to move on to the next slide. Great. What have I done with my notes? We'll get there. Okay, one of the areas in the project proposal that people wanted us to clarify was the presumption of fraud risk in revenue recognition, and a second element of it, which was and is there anything else, any other areas that we should look at whether there is a presumption of fraud risk? So we have addressed the fraud risk, and we have, our current thinking is that we have a shift of focus. Currently, the setting is that you develop a rebuttal for the presumption of fraud risk and revenue recognition. Our proposal is that we move it to performing robust risk identification and assessment, and then deciding what else has to be done. So what we have done is written material on that basis, and we intend to take into account the fraud risk factors in doing that. We have also added application material in terms of which other accounts may well be useful in terms of looking at the presumption of fraud risk. And we have determined that because fraud revenue recognition is not a large part of the work one does in the public sector, accepting that taxes are really important for the public sector, it's really an expenditure-driven audit, that we need some particular and special application material in terms of the public sector. So that's where we've got to in terms of the presumption of fraud risk and revenue recognition. 3 parts: changing the focus, adding some other balances, and looking at the public sector. So with that, we can move on to the next slide, where we have 2 parts of the question, as well as the normal anything else question. The first one is, do you agree with our enhancements to shift the auditor's focus to risk assessment rather than rebuttal? And do you agree that there is sufficient guidance in A28A on other balances, particularly those susceptible to material misstatement due to fraud? So with that, Tom, I will pass back to you for the next round of discussion. Thank you.
Okay, anyone want to come in on questions 7 and 8? Sachika.
Thank you. I have 2 comments on this issue. And first comment is on paragraph A30 and A31. And by the way, I support the direction on question 7. With that in mind, I received a feedback from the practitioners in Japan that when looking at paragraph A31, they got an impression that it is easier to rebut the presumption compared to the ex-ante either 240. I think this is because paragraph 831 seems to suggest that the auditor can rebut the presumption if there is, if the nature of the revenue transaction is simple and the applicable recognition criteria is straightforward and non-complex. But in reality, fraud could exist in that scenario. But I think the intention is that the auditor needs to consider paragraph A30 and, like the previous slide, fraud triangles and other factors together in totality with what is currently described in paragraph A31 to conclude that there is no fraud risk relating to revenue recognition, rather than just looking at paragraph A31 in isolation. So maybe my suggestion is to clarify this point in the standard. And next comment is with regard to question 8. I think with regard to this issue, it is also important to clarify what action is needed once the auditor determines that the presumption is applicable, because some practitioners may intend to develop rebuttal because the action after the risk assessment is unclear or misunderstood, because the response to the risk could differ between when the risk is based on certain suspicion that there is a specific fraud risk and when the risk is based on the presumption that there is a fraud. For example, I think the further procedure should be different when the auditor does not find anything suspicious, but do not rebut, since the auditor does not have enough valid support to rebut the presumption, as opposed to when the auditor finds suspicious records that indicate fraud risk in revenue actually, but the current either is not clear about it. So in order to shift the focus from the auditor to develop a rebuttal, maybe we need to also clarify what the further required actions are when the auditor identified fraud risk based on suspected fraud or the presumption of fraud risk in revenue recognition. And I know maybe this is for future discussion when we get the discussion about requirement and application material when fraud is identified or suspected. But I want to raise this now because it, I think, really relate to the presumption issue as well. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Sashika. Yosh?
Thank you, Chair Tom, and Oh. Sorry. This is first time to present my comments, so I want to say thank you for the Lean and the task force. Very hard work about the fraud project. As I have been supportive to enhancing the auditor's responsibility for fraud from the beginning of this project. I also focused on this proposal and appreciate this detailed paper and support the question 7 and question 8. I have just one comment about the paragraph A30A. I support for examples of types of revenue transactions and situations related to assertion related to fraud risk is useful in practice. In addition to what is presented here, I would like the task force to consider specifying change in contractual terms related to revenue recognition, which is including terms for collection of receivables and situations suggesting channel stuffing and situations suggesting round tripping. These are in Japan very troublesome for many times as a regulator to address such fraud transactions we experienced. These are examples that might be inherent to us, but frequently become the problem in Japan. So please consider add the example here. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Yosh. Edo?
Yes, thank you. In respect of the shifting away, I think it's there, but there's this niggle whether we're strong enough, and so also went back and it's in your issues paper, of course, that the project proposal says clarify when it's inappropriate to do so, whereas your language says or approaches it when it is appropriate to do so. And I was also thinking if we inverse that, whether that would be a little bit stronger, but I can't really come up with a very good suggestion to make it stronger. But I would have expected a little bit stronger emphasis on the when it's not appropriate. And
Eric?
Thanks, Tom, and again, supportive of the approach of shifting the focus away. But in my outreach, I did find, and I recognize there's two ways of looking at this, but when we create these long lists, it tends to become a situation where people try to work through each of the points and sort of whether they're in or whether they're out, and whether we just need more along the lines of what Edo was saying, more messages around when it's inappropriate to rebut the presumption. And I think that was kind of Sachiko's point as well on one of the application material paragraphs. My only other question was really around the requirement, and where it says by taking into account the fraud risk factors. And I was just a little bit worried about what that meant in terms of the work effort. What is it we're intending there? Does the auditor have to go through fraud risk factor by fraud risk factor and do an assessment of whether that is related to the presumption of fraud risk and revenue recognition, and what would that mean to the documentation of that? So I was just raising that as a question, whether we could clarify what we really intend by that requirement. Thanks.
Okay, I'm looking to see if anyone else wants to come in. Lynn, back to you.
Thank you, Sachiko. We weren't trying to make paragraph A31 easier than extent. So we obviously need to look at that, but can I assure the board that that wasn't our intention in terms of that section. What I've heard is that we once again need to do better connections across some of these paragraphs so that there is more clarity as people work through it. That we need to think about the further procedures. We need to look at whether we are being strong enough and when it is not appropriate for the presumption. And I have also heard to be careful of lists. So there's some geography here, but some substantive points as well. Eric, in terms of the fraud risk factors, I could say, in summary, it's work in progress. That the principles we are working on is that we will keep the fraud risk factors as they in the appendix, but we'll update them and change them to be more modern, and that we will try and work them better into the actual standard as well. And that is certainly in its early days, but that's the framework we're thinking of in terms of the fraud risk factors. So this is one of our sort of stakes to say, and here's one of the places we'll look at it. So I think that is all there is on that one. Tom, back to you. It's probably a convenient time to break rather than trying to move on to the next section.
Great minds think alike, because I was just going to suggest that. So we will break now for a half an hour. So we'll reconvene at 10 minutes to the hour. So you get your full break. But I think we should take advantage of a little slight progress we've made. Okay, I've been just informed you get in a 40-minute break, so we'll reconvene at the hour when we were supposed to reconvene in the first place. We'll 11 a.m. our time here. Okay, we're going to start in about a minute. Okay, everyone's back. I think, Lynn, we're ready to go to part 2.
Excellent, thank you very much. And we're now up to journal entries, which was a important part of the project proposal. What you have on the screen in front of you is the model that we are thinking about in terms of journal entries. As Jasper talked about, when we do the assessment under 315, we get an understanding of the entity, the financial reporting framework, and the system of internal controls. We put that together in what looks like a cocktail glass, looking at the nature, extent, and timing of what we might do. And out of that falls a testing approach. That is the basic model that we are trying to encapsulate in the standard at this point in time. One of the key issues that we have discussed is the importance about making sure when you are doing journal entries that you have a complete population. And we have very deliberately included material in the standard about completeness. That mirrors what's in 500 in terms of completeness, and I thank the task force for the interactions we've had between the two of us in that regard. As a final point before we move to questions in the area of journal entries, which I can't emphasise enough how important this area is, we have also in the application material looked at the auditor using automated tools and techniques when testing, and it is our intention to run a technology theme through this revised standard, largely in the application material, using examples like we have here. So, next slide, please. In terms of this question, and we are looking at paragraph 33A as a requirement, and the application material is A42 to A45A. Is the first question is whether the enhancements provide the auditor with a robust framework for determining the nature, timing, and extent of journal entries and other adjustments, whether you believe it's appropriately scalable and proportionate, and is there anything else that can be done to modernise the testing of journal entries and other adjustments? And then in terms of question 10, anything else that we need to know at this stage? And all questions will be answered by Diane in this area.
I just thought we were very intentional about doing this on her birthday since it's her favorite topic. Yes. Billy's in charge of the calendar, so. Okay. Who would like to come in on question 9? Sachika.
Thank you. I'm not sure whether it's a birthday present to Diane or not, but with regard to the question on journal entry testing, actually, I have an overall comment on this issue because I am a bit struggling with understanding how the proposed wording changed the auditor's current practice. Because I understand the task force's wording change. It to address the key issue identified in project proposal is that uncertainty about how to select which journal entries to test. And that has resulted in inconsistent application. And I strongly supported this key issue to be addressed because I have heard a lot of views from Japanese practitioners that they think the testing is not as effective considering the amount of time and the effort required. And in some cases, analytical procedures using technologies are more effective. And I thought this issue could be addressed by providing some guidance around how to identify and select journal entries and other adjustment for testing based on result of risk assessment, or explaining how this testing is effective to detect fraud. But before the board meeting, I have some meeting with Japanese practitioners, and they said they do not see the proposed revision will make any difference in their current practice. And I'm also not sure how the proposed change address the key issue and help the practitioners to select journal entry testings. And at this time of moment, I'm so sorry, I do not have any wording suggestion on how to address it. And I need to think further to have some suggestion, but I just would like to raise it right now rather than later, since this is my current view. That's all. Thank you.
Sue?
Thanks. I thought this spelt out the framework very clearly, and it plugs some gaps that are there at the moment. So I was very supportive of this. I know we are often technology neutral in the standards, and we work really hard to recognise that that's the case. But I did wonder whether you might be able to go a little bit further in some of this material to emphasise that in some cases, automated techniques may be able to give insight and assist in the identification of journals that will then warrant further investigation. Thanks.
Wendy?
Yeah, I echo some of Sachika's comments. I'm not sure we've gone far enough to affect change in behavior. One suggestion we came up with was perhaps taking some of the items in A44 and making them part of the requirements. I know we don't like to be, we want to keep principles based, but I thought it might be helpful, some of those items, and have the same comment related to technology here, that I think this is an opportunity to bring up when auditors might benefit from the use of technology in this testing.
Eric?
Thanks, Tom. And like Sue, supportive of the development of the framework and articulating that. Just a couple of suggestions to consider. I think what we've been suggesting is perhaps to strengthen the it was good to add the paragraph on why the testing of journal entries and other adjustments is performed, but it could be helpful to add a bit more substance on why it's important to use journal entry testing to detect inappropriate entries. Secondly, appreciate adding the requirement in 33A too about the completeness of the population. But I did get a couple of questions back as to what population are we talking about here? Are we talking about all the journal entries within the whole general ledger, or are we talking about the population that the auditor intends to test that is required to be assessed? It wasn't clear to some of my stakeholders. And following on from 33A4, which is talking about the period covered, there's a suggestion that perhaps there could be examples of when it may not be appropriate to test journal entries only at the year end, to sort of emphasize or promote the use of testing throughout the period. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Warren?
Thanks, Tom. My views are very similar to those already expressed, so I won't repeat those. I just wonder, I agree that it's great that we state explicitly that we need to look at the completeness of the population. I take the point about what population means, but we're testing the completeness of it, and that's great. But I think that when it comes to the journal entries, because of their nature and their relevance in the whole fraud assessment and response process, I think we might want to consider thinking about the sort of the quality of the information that we're testing specifically, and not only look at completeness, so things like authenticity and bias, and those other quality factors that we were chatting about in our earlier meetings a few days ago, are probably equally relevant when it comes to evaluating the journals. Maybe here is an opportunity to cross-reference more explicitly, excuse me, to ISA 500. Thank you.
Thank you, Warren. Kai?
Thank you. I also was struggling a bit with the population thing, and also maybe on the opposite side saying, if you test the population, when is it not appropriate to test the completeness of the population that you're pulling samples from? Because I think it is part of when you're doing sampling and testing, when you're pulling out something, you would always have to make sure that it's complete. So I was struggling a bit with it, but I understand why it's there, but what it really is telling me, I'm not sure.
Thank you. Anyone else like to come in? Hey, Lynn, back to you.
Over to Diane.
Thanks, Lynn. That was all very helpful. I mean, I definitely appreciate the comments, Sachiko. I think you're spot on, and we could probably do more about what action needs to be taken, like, and also helping guide the selection. I mean, that's the magic, right? You've got this population. How do you choose what you choose? Are they qualitative filters? Are they quantitative filters? What's the ordering, and so on? So I think we can build that out with some good examples. I think the other comments in here about technology is spot on. We can build some of that in about making smart selections, especially when applying it against an overall population. My personal view, when we talk about the population, it was the complete population of an organization. And these are a little bit concerning again when the client says to you, gee, I can't give you the full population. That should be a red flag. But I do think we can build in some examples to help guide that thought process and plant some seeds in the practitioner to say that might be something we want to follow up. And then Eric, I like your comment about examples when it would not be appropriate to test it only at year, and I think that's a good thing. Again, my personal view is you test throughout the year, but it may not be for everybody. So we'll work through that, but I do think that's something to focus on. Good. Thanks for the input, everybody. It was a great birthday present.
Well, you did ask for presents, so you got one.
We may need to give you a bumper sticker for your computer that says "I love journal entry." Fiona used to have one that said "I love audit."
Yeah. I'd just add one other thing is the really important linkage we're setting up explicitly now of the risk of material misstatement in 315 and using that to determine your population and how you do your testing.
and you're spot on, because that goes back to Sachiko's comments, which are, even jurisdictionally, if you believe you're worried about a particular component because they operate in a particular industry or that division is particularly hard pressed from a performance standpoint, that may guide and should guide your selections of journal entries. So that connection points will work on that.
Excellent. We're doing very well. We're now going to move on to communication with management and those charged with governance. And what we are trying to achieve in this area is putting a lot more emphasis on the ongoing discussions that an auditor should have, both with management and those charged with governance. The first thing we're trying to encourage is that to happen regularly throughout the audit. I'm actually working from right to left here rather than left to right. So just the orange bit on the right. It's that this is not a send a questionnaire to management and those charged with governance at the end of the audit. This is at every stage of the audit, making sure that you have communication with those two groups and that they are moving back to the middle, specific about fraud-related matters. So you're asking specific questions, you're having specific discussions, you're talking to them about whether they've got any frauds that are happening, whether they suspect there are any frauds, whether they have got risks in terms of their internal controls that they're concerned about. And moving back to the left-hand side now, that's two-way. It's not just a auditor ask, those charged with governance and management answer. It is them contributing in an active way and setting up the audit so that happens. So that is the way we are thinking about communicating with those charged with governance. A small point, but just in case anyone brings it up, we have considered whether we should put the order of that to be those charged with governance and management, but the convention across all the ISAs is the management and those charged with governance. So that's why they are in that order. And what was the other thing that I wanted to cover? The other item here that we have struggled with, and when we get the questions is explicit, but let me explain why we are struggling with it, is where we put this in the standard. Currently, we have got it nearer to the end than the beginning. We've done that deliberately to put it all together and bring it together, but very interested in terms of that's our best position at this point in time, but we are open to the fact that it might have to move to another place. So with that, we can move on to the questions in this area, which are firstly, and once again, it's paragraph 40A, so there's a lot of grey before this one, and then there are 3 paragraphs of application material. First one is, do you agree with our enhanced requirements and related application material appropriately addresses two-way communication and the ongoing nature of communications with those charged with governance? And is paragraph 40A the right place to have this information? So those are the 2 questions. Tom, back to you.
Thank you. Bill?
Yeah, full compliments for having this in the document. I think it's a major piece. It was explained yesterday, or someone mentioned, I think it was Warren, that there's a growing number of things we're going to keep reporting to management, and we need to make sure we coordinate that. But I just think it's one of the most powerful things we can do at the moment to address issues like fraud and going concern and others. So very encouraging of that. And in doing that, I think two of the key principles are, one is that it's got to be timely, and therefore it's got to be started early in the audit. And therefore, to answer your question, Lynn, I probably would move it up earlier in the standard accordingly, but that's a principle across all of the communication with those charged with management. And the other piece is that in our outreach, I did hear some commentary around how can you make two-way communication? You can't make management communicate, but I would not want us to step back from that at all, because I think it is imperative that we whatever the word might be, make sure management do get into that dialogue.
Wendy?
So, thank you, Tom. See, we took 22A out of this, so we're just on 48, 22A, which I like. And I guess my comment's probably similar to Bill's, that should 40A be closer to 22A, and is it just a similar statement that we make in a lot of other standards? I wasn't really sure how it was specific here to fraud.
Okay, Yosh?
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Wolf. The emphasis on continuous two-way communication with TCWG is very important, and I strongly support the direction of this proposal. However, requiring the same response in all phases of an audit without any distinction might lead to formal or careless responses by auditors. So I believe that the communication with TCWG and management needs to be strengthened and deepened, especially when facts and signs of fraud or new fraud risks are identified. Based on such different situations, it would be useful to include additional provisions for multi-step gearing up procedures, I think. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Edo?
Yes, thank you. Putting my 10 down first before I forget. In respect to this question, so Lynn, I think the bullet in A60A was probably where you were referring to, and that's where my comment is that I would have liked it to be a little bit stronger, a bit of stronger push by the auditor to understand how those charged with governments are comfortable with companies' fraud risk management, rather than just oversight. So that's, I think, discuss. It's all captured under communicate, and what we do see in practice is that that the auditor will share his or her perspectives on it, and it will discuss risk factors, possible areas, etc. And then those charged with governance will say, well, that's good, thank you very much, and that's it. So it is this active inquiry rather than just presenting. And that's, I'm not sure how to grab that. I know you've used discuss previously in, what is it, 22, which you think is better than communicate, but so that's my comment. Thank you.
Wolf?
Kai was very much in favor of this requirement. He had a concern with respect to the words related to fraud, because that could be interpreted as almost anything. And what you communicate with management and those charged with governance about would be very different. So for example, you might speak to management about certain things that you wouldn't necessarily talk to those charged with governance about. So for those charged with governance, it might be matters related to risk of material fraud or management fraud, or matters of governance interest relating to fraud. So the question is whether you need to actually split the two to give some indication as to what matters you're going to be discussing with whom.
Warren?
Thanks, Tom. I'd actually like to just build on Wolf's point. I think there's probably a lot of merit. Well, first of all, let me start off by saying that, yes, Bill, it was me. I'm not a big fan of long lists of discussion points for those charged with governance. But in this particular case, I'm very much in favor of these paragraphs, and I think that they're very well clearly written. So now, to build on Wolf's point, I think there might be merit in actually requiring auditors or mandating that they actually discuss their different fraud considerations with the different levels of management, not just as a procedural issue, but also for the purposes of creating a platform where different levels of management or different governance structures within the organization can actually talk openly to the auditor about their concerns about suspected fraud. So that would be one suggestion to take into account. And I think we might also want to be explicit about the fact that you want to talk to management and those charged with governance about fraud risk factors, but the conversation you have with them might itself be the fraud risk factor. So where the conversation is cagey or it's forthright, or as one speaker said earlier, it tends to be very legalistic, or they tend to try and shut down the conversation, that those factors should probably be woven into your assessment and response to the overall risk of misstatement due to fraud. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Anyone else come in? I see some nodding and lots of note taking. I think very helpful suggestions. Lynn, back to you.
Thank you. I think we got some very clear messages there. The first was if we can find a place, move this up earlier, because we do want to flow it through the entire audit. And some really good suggestions for some more granularity in the application material, because there are different circumstances. Obviously, you're going to have a completely different conversation with those two parties if you've got a suspected or actual fraud than you're going to have when you're just looking at the risk factors. So they are different, and we'll try and see if we can move some of those into the discussion. I hear the words about discuss, communicate. We'll have another look at that. Also, whether we need to split between management and those charged with governance. I'm curious about your comment, Warren, about the tone of the conversation, because I absolutely agree with it. And it's that judgment instinct that we all have as auditors. Whether we can write it into a standard might be a bit more of a challenge. So I hear you, and I agree with you. I just think that it could be challenging to take it forward as a concept. But I'm hearing a lot of agreement with what we've done here, a lot of support for it, just some more granular information, some more application material could be helpful. Anything anyone else in the task force wants to add to that?
Janine wants to comment.
Yes, thanks. I'd like to make a suggestion. I think it would be very important that there is a little bit more as a requirement here, as also I sensed that there are also some that made that comment, but in particular in relation to significant deficiencies in controls to prevent and detect fraud. That's the third bullet under A60A. And in particular, having a discussion with management on what they're going to do about those significant deficiencies. I would really like to see that being strengthened in the standard and not just as application material. Thank you.
Thanks, Janine.
Okay. Anyone else? Then back to you.
Okay, I'd just, Tom, like to pause on question 12 here, because this is there anything else anyone wants to tell us? Because after this, I'm going to brief you about where we're at and where we're going forward. So this is just the last opportunity for input. Thanks, Tom.
Anything people want to raise in response to question 12? See no hands. Back to you, Lynn.
Thank you. Could we have the next slide, please? Okay, you'll remember at the March meeting, we had quite a significant discussion on transparency in the auditor's report. This was a major issue we heard from the discussion paper and is a significant part of the project proposal. It's likely to be the topic that comes back to every single meeting, and the purpose of today is to give you an update about where we have got to in terms of that work. And I should acknowledge the great work that Jasper has done in terms of moving us forward here. Where we're at is in March, we put in front of you 4 options of how this could be reported in the auditor's report. Remember, we used the Netherlands and UK examples, and we had 2 hybrids from there. Over the last few months, we have worked on producing a little paper that sets out those 4 options and explains them in some detail that we can use as the basis of our outreach. We have also added 1 more option to that paper, which is one that would be based on internal controls. So that little paper has been prepared and is currently being given to the users of financial statements that we are going to talk to between June and July this year. I think the first one starts next week, so we're well into talking to those people. We intend to talk to around 20 people across the globe. The discussions are focused on users, absolutely, not any other stakeholders. We're very clear what other people are looking at. It is particular users of financial statements that we are talking to. We are worked very hard to make sure that we get a global perspective and that we're not biased towards any particular geographical area or any particular group of people, other than users, of course. So we are having that discussion. Whilst we have 2 open questions to ask them, we have some prompts in the background. The intention is that 1 task force member and 1 staff member attends each of those interviews. They'll all be on Zoom, so they are virtual meetings. But what we want to have is a full discussion with the users, not just what they want in terms of the auditor's report, but what they're going to use it for. And we're putting a particular emphasis on what are you going to use this particular part of the auditor's report for. When we have completed those 20 interviews, we intend to do a summary of the information and we will report that back to the board in our September meeting. So it will be a very narrow report back just on those issues. So we may not even do a paper on this. We may just be briefing you on the matters in a PowerPoint presentation. So we're in a report backstage in terms of this issue. We'll then work on obviously putting that into the standard as we work up to the December meeting. So that's where we're at on transparency in the auditor's report. Next slide, please. So where to from here? I've largely talked about this slide, but let me be repetitive for a second. June, July is our users of financial statements interviews, and also taking the work that we've done in this meeting and reflecting it in the draft standard. Into September, we'll give the update I've just talked about. And in December, you can expect us to come back with all the issues we've talked about in March, June and September, plus one or two others. There may be a few left over for the March 2023 meeting. They are likely to be the ones that are very self-obvious, that we know what we're going to do, we know how we're going to do it, and we may just leave them to the first read of the standard rather than for discussion. So that's where we intend to go over the next few months. So Tom, that completes our presentation as a task force and staff on the revised fraud standard. But if anyone has any questions on transparency all the way forward, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you. Any questions to Lynn? Sashiko?
Thank you, Lynn. I think this is a very, very important outreach. And in March meeting, I think I commented that in addition to users, I think more broad outreach is needed because this is the issue that the financial reporting ecosystem totality should address. So I wonder whether you and your team discussed about the possibility of expanding outreach to other key stakeholders. That's my question.
We did. And we've decided our urgent need at this point in time is the users of financial statements. We are continuing to liaise with other groups, the other stakeholders through our ongoing and normal outreach. We'll bring the fraud work back from that. But at present, we have decided within that big context to take this bit because it is the area we're most unclear about and we most need information. So we're prioritising our resource to do that. Doesn't mean we're not talking to other stakeholders because obviously we need to talk to the entire ecosystem here and we are doing that, I can assure you. It's just we need to put our focus on detailed interviews with these users so we get that information. So yeah, we heard you, we did consider it, and that was what we decided.
Thank you. Yeah.
Maybe in addition to that, so we in the discussion paper we heard back from a lot of different stakeholder groups, and the only group where we didn't hear back from was from investors, so users of the financial statements, and that was the specific reason why we did outreach with that stakeholder group. And not with others. Just to give a little bit of background.
Yeah, and of course, we will always get input when it comes to the ED stage from other stakeholders, and I assume that there'll be significant outreach as a result of that. Okay, Jim Dalkin, any observations on our fraud discussion?
Thanks, Tom. And I think based on our CAG discussions that you've considered a number of our comments, and I'm actually happy to see the progress that's being made with respect to the fraud. So I don't really have any other specific items. There was some talk about within the risk assessment considering external information. And I don't know if I saw that or maybe that was in the appendix, but that would be the only other comment I have.
Janine?
Yes, thanks. Well, I can say that I'm very encouraged by the work done by the task force. The proposals discussed today are in line with the project proposal and with the PIOB's recommendations. Introducing suspected fraud is important for the mindset of auditors, as the auditors should be focused on suspected fraud and not only on fraud that has already been detected by others and legally assessed as such. And I think explicitly addressing suspected fraud in the standard is a big step forward. Also, the focus given on internal controls is important to lower the detection risks in audits. Key is that the revised 240 will actually drive improved behaviors in practice so that auditors are better positioned to detect material misstatements due to fraud. And auditors having to determine something together with the documentation requirements instead of only having to consider will contribute to improved behaviors in practice. So I was pleased with the outcome of the discussion on specialized skills to keep determine in. I like to encourage the task force to further explore external sources of information as part of other information that the auditor should take into account, and specific considerations to important aspects like culture and tone at the top, and to the role of the group auditor regarding the risk of material misstatement due to fraud at component level, given lessons learned from accounting scandals. And last but not least, how IT innovations, including data analytical tools, could contribute to the detection of fraud. There was also already an application material around journal entry testing, but that's, I think, an important aspect as well. So overall, I'm very encouraged by the direction the project is taken, by strengthening the audit procedures and by the upcoming targeted outreach to investors, how to best enhance transparency through the auditor report. So thanks a lot for the good work.
Thank you, Janine. Lynn, I'll leave it to you to conclude this session.
Okay. As Janine was talking, I have been remiss. We had, in terms of technology, a very good discussion with Danielle in terms of where we might go, and I just wanted to acknowledge and thank her for her input and in advance for how she's going to help us going forward to make sure we run that theme of technology through the standard. So we have a great resource there that we should be using. So with that, I'd just like to say thank you very much to the board. What I have heard is that we're conceptually heading in the right way, but we've got work to do to actually make it clearer. So that's very comforting as a way forward. I'd like to conclude by just thanking Jesper and Sally Ann for their presentations. It's great to have you presenting and being an active part of this. And to everybody, what has characterised this has been discussion rather than one-to-one conversations, and I think that was really valuable. So many, many thanks, and I'm sure you will wait for the next update in September with bated breath. So thank you, Tom, and
Lynn, may I thank you for your leadership of the task force. Clearly, it was great to have Sally Ann and Jesper do such a great job. I think the staff have done a great job this week in presenting. I think that's great to have them involved in the plenary sessions. And I want to thank the task force and, of course, most importantly, the board for being willing to step up and have real discussions to make the standard a better one. Okay, we will close early today, but there are a few announcements and discuss points we want to raise. You're due to get some materials this afternoon, both on PI and on audit evidence. I'm going to ask Sue to preview the audit evidence first.
Okay, thank you. You haven't had an email yet, but if you take a sneak look on the IAASB meetings website, the paper is there if you want to download that early. I think there'll be an email coming out a little bit later with both the documents for the turn. Thanks obviously to the task force and the team for for allowing us to spend time reflecting on the feedback we had. What we've presented to you is the full ISA rather than taking sections out, because I'm conscious you'll probably want to refer to other parts when you're looking at the changes that we've made. There are grayed out sections, as is common with these things. If you've sent us offline comments, or you might see there's notes in those grayed out sections, that's areas that we're still working on. So we will take account of any comments that we've received. What I really like us to do tomorrow is focus on the requirements and the relevant application material. We have worked through all of those. So 8, 9, 9A, 11, 12, 13. So you'll be getting all of those. And obviously, you know, it'd be great to get the feedback to help our work in September. If there's capacity tomorrow, there are. We've also worked on the objectives and a couple of other minor changes, but we'll see how we go with the feedback tomorrow. As I say, the real thing is if we can get your feedback on the requirements and the application material there, then hopefully that'll put us in a good position for September. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. So any questions for Sue?
One more thing is we were not proposing to print out copies for everybody. If you do want a paper copy, then if you could let Phil know, we can arrange for that. But I think most people are working virtually, and it seems in line with the sustainability goals to not go creating mountains of paper.
Good point. Josephine.
Whoopsie, Pi Task Force will be printing out hard copies, but I guess there's not as many pages. So we're still sticking to our posting at 1 p.m, not too far away. So look out for that. And as I say, we'll put hard copies on the table. Fewer changes made to ISA 700, not as many suggestions on actually the ISA 700 piece anyway, but where we did have suggestions, sometimes they were in conflict with each other. So it's like, well, we better just stay where we are then from that perspective. Some suggestions that were made as well would impact other aspects of ISA 700 by their nature. And so we really wanted to just focus on operationalizing that auditor assertion regarding differential requirements. The one thing we do want, we would ask the board to think about is ISA 260. And if you recall from Monday, there were quite a few requests that those the May conversation in the application material was really something that should happen in all cases. So you should always communicate which relevant ethical requirements you've applied to those charged with governance. And in paragraph 17 of the standard, it's not explicit, but it is implicit. However, I know that doesn't satisfy a number of comments. Track 1 was really scoped just to operationalize that auditor's assertion that differential requirements apply. That was our focus. And there isn't any requirement in the IAASB code to make this communication to those charged with governance. And if you remember, IAASB actually didn't want to go down that route. So we have no hook to make any changes to our requirements, even if we wanted to. That would be a wider discussion of the board anyway. We have made an adjustment to ISA 260 proposals that move slightly away from the May, and hopefully it'll be a better way of articulating what it was we were trying to get across, which is that if you are going to make this assertion in your auditor's report, it's something you probably want to mention to those charged with governance. And so we've made some adjustments to the application material, and hopefully that piece is clearer. But having, reflected on it, if the board also want to reflect on it, there are 3 options here. One option is actually we just don't deal with 260 at all. And we think about that as we have to anyway as part of track 2, when we're thinking about that paragraph 17 as a differential requirement anyway. And that might also deal with some of the other questions that came through on that piece. We can expose the adjusted wording, which you'll see today. Or if you're not comfortable with that adjusted wording, then we could revert back to the original text that we presented on Monday. So you've got a couple of options there to think about when you're looking at the revised wording in 260. But yeah, hopefully, certainly by 1, Kalina's tried to get it out a little bit earlier for you, but that should be imminent. Thank you, Tom.
Any questions for Josephine? Billy?
No, I don't have a question for you. Right, so just a few administrative announcements. So for today, we will get lunch. They will be here at 12:30. That's the earliest we could get them to arrive. And just remember, because they are going to start to clean this room for the meeting this afternoon, lunch is being set up in the kitchen on the 6th floor. So, so that will be in about 40 minutes. Then the other thing is, Michelle, maybe just if you can stop the recording.
So we're breaking into executive now, right? So